Hi, my name is Jonathan Richard Schwarz. I'm a research fellow at Harvard University and have been an AI research scientist for the last 5 to 10 years. I'm here today to answer the general public's questions about artificial intelligence. This is Street Smart Science.
If I could ask an expert one thing about AI, I would ask,
I have one actually.
How does someone code AI? Like, what software does it use? How do they program it, kind of, I guess?
Okay, so how does AI actually work? How do people develop AI? In my opinion, there's 3 components. There's the pure software component. The big part about AI is also the data that we collect to train AI. And the third part is the kind of state-of-the-art compute cluster hardware accelerators that are extremely expensive and that we need in order to train these things very quickly. In terms of the software, this can really be done even on a small laptop. This just looks like any other kind of software development. A lot of people work on Python for the sort of people that know programming languages, but the kind of secret sauce really comes in terms of the algorithms that people develop in the scientific literature or in private companies. And then once the software is developed, the way AI training works is that you effectively go through these huge data sets time and time again, and you make sort of small steps of improvement in order to get just a little bit better at the task every single time you take a step. And for the most complex systems, a process like this can take weeks, if not months, and often can cost hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars.
what safeguards are being put in place or being talked about so that AI doesn't get into the wrong hands or it isn't used for nefarious purposes?
Yeah, so the legal regulation and the law side of AI is a very active topic at the moment. In the UK, we had the AI Safety Summit. We have the Biden-Harris administration's executive order on AI in the European Union's AI Act that is currently being negotiated between the European Union Parliament and the Council, and that could really be kind of a first-of-its-kind legal framework. The difficult questions here are often questions of how do we regulate without over-regulation? So that means that if you regulate too little, perhaps you could have all these nefarious users and it would be easy for people to misuse AI. But if you overregulate, it could mean that really the sort of promise and the economic potential of AI is concentrated in the hand of only a few players. And that itself could then mean that we really don't harness all the fantastic benefits that AI has to offer. And so this is kind of a really complex tension at the moment that in civil society, but also on this kind of governmental stage, people are trying to discuss together.
So in the future, how do you think is like gonna be the legal point of view through like AI and like in medicine?
AI in medicine, I think, is a really, really interesting, fascinating topic. We're now on the stage where really through a person's entire life, there are various kind of forms of AI coming in to help at that stage. So for instance, in later life, there's a lot of work being done on figuring out the kind of adverse effects that come from taking multiple drugs at the same time. There are other things such as diagnosing chest x-rays. There are things such as detecting early blinding eye diseases. And really they have this huge potential of reducing suffering, but also possibly cutting healthcare costs, which is a big worry with aging populations at the moment. A big question though in healthcare here is the kind of question of bias and fairness. So often you will find that your system performs incredibly well across the board, but if you then break the data apart and you look a bit more closely, we can see that there's a certain amount of bias in subcategories. So in the chest x-ray example, actually it turns out that if you look at the number of people that were told that they're healthy, even if they're not healthy, so this is kind of the worst case outcome, that proportion was higher for young patients, for black patients, for patients on public medical insurance and for women. And so this is kind of one of those examples where the ethics of AI really come into play, and we need to be careful to make sure that we have kind of good standards before we release these systems.
How will AI exactly impact teenagers in the next 30 or 40 years?
I think that AI will impact young people's lives, not just in the next 30 or 40 years, but basically immediately from now on. And one of the first ones that we'll now have to think about is the nature of education with tools like ChatGPT and other chatbots. Of course, there's a question of how do we fairly examine the sort of students that come to university or are in school. But also there's a real positive use, that is that a lot of people are excited about building personalized sort of assistants that can help you understand concepts in a way that maybe the teacher wouldn't be able to, or doesn't have the time for each individual student. My best advice for young folks is to really try and understand what AI can do and think about leveraging this for creative new purposes. So at the moment there's a huge spark and a creative explosion in terms of entrepreneurial ideas, startup scene, creatives that use AI in even in social media sort of targeted campaigns or advertising. And I think it's really for your generation to make sure that you harness this technology to its maximum kind of potential. And then finally, I think one thing that we all have to get used to is we will see a lot more AI-generated content out there. And this is really means that all of us need to get a lot better at critical thinking and kind of realize that every time we look at something online, there will be an increasing probability that this isn't generated by a human. And so we need to think about what were the intentions of the people kind of creating this sort of content, and can we trust it?
We'd like to ask, have they ever been really thinking ethical and philosophical point of view, what they are doing, what are their aims? Are they sure about that?
Yeah, I would like to know, when would they know where to draw the line with it? Or will there be a line at all?
This is a really interesting question. I think it's fair to say that ethics in AI has been something people have been speaking about for a long time. So for multiple decades, those questions were perhaps a bit more theoretical in the sort of philosophical nature. So questions such as, when do we know whether or not we actually have achieved AI? What does that mean? Could we ever have a sentient or conscious system? But over the last couple of years, and especially in the last 12 months or so, we've really seen ethics come into play in real-world problems. Questions about minorities and bias that we have in multicultural societies. There's a big questions around ethics in a field called AI alignment. So the idea here is we want the AI to kind of behave in accordance with our kind of moral and ethical understandings of our societies. But of course that means that somebody somewhere, maybe a developer or a chief executive, have to define what human values are. And so in order for the AI to be aligned in that way. And of course that means that there's a question around power of who should be deciding on these values. Should it be private corporations? Should it be civil society? How does that differ in a democratic society versus a non-democratic society? Those are all really important questions. This is not a question just for AI engineers and researchers, it's a question for all of us to try and answer together.
Is it wise to have public access to lots of forms of AI? And should it just be reserved for scientists or academics?
Yeah, the kind of question of access, maybe one thing that people don't quite realize is that even some of our scientists and engineers don't actually have access to all forms of AI. So we might have access to the trained system, but we might not have access to kind of the mathematical details required to reproduce it. Or even worse, even if we had the mathematical details, we don't have access to these really expensive, huge compute clusters that cost hundreds of millions of dollars to train, right? So the current status is actually that the most impactful systems are trained by private corporations. And, there has been a certain trend for these corporations to kind of reveal less about their secret sauce, if you will. So I think the question here is somewhere in the middle. There clearly are some benefits to releasing things. So economic kind of opportunity is a big one. If these things are released more widely, we can expect more startups and companies doing interesting things. You could also argue that releasing them publicly is actually a bigger form of scrutiny than simply trusting an actor that promises to be safe. Actually, if we have access to the data and the model and the implementation, well, then we can check for ourselves and sort of judge for ourselves of how safe these systems are. On the other hand, of course, that means that nefarious actors then also have access to these systems and can use them for these other purposes. So I think at the moment, this is really a question that we don't have a good answer for just yet, and it seems to me that both extremes have their advantages and disadvantages. But I would say overall, for the kind of most clearly beneficial circumstances such as health and climate, we should do the absolute best we can do to enable those scientists to work as productively as possible with AI.
How in the future are we going to be able to know what training data is used for algorithms like ChatGPT?
Yeah, so this is a really important question and relates very closely to privacy. The good news is that a lot of the algorithmic foundations for this are being developed. So there's a notion of a field called differential privacy. And in layman's terms, that's the property of not being able to tell much about an individual kind of user's data, or whether or not the data is included, by merely looking at the output of an AI model. Other forms of privacy could be that a model has been trained perhaps on your data, but you're no longer comfortable with it being used. And there's a notion of unlearning in the sense that we want to change the system such that it behaves as though your data was never included in the first place.
How is AI going to impact the climate crisis?
Yeah, a lot of the work with AI for the climate crisis sort of is still ongoing. Some of the exciting projects that already exist is one called nowcasting. So nowcasting means that we can forecast the weather in very short time horizons, so just think 2 hours or less. That sort of technology is very important to react to catastrophic events or floods or extreme rains. These systems are getting better and better, and that will allow us to kind of react more appropriately to the kind of extreme weather conditions we can expect. A project I myself was involved in was the sort of question about compression of climate data. So climate data actually is very rapidly becoming the largest scientific database in the world. And because of its size, it's incredibly difficult for people to work with this kind of data. So one of the systems we developed allows this data to be compressed into much smaller chunks of data that people can transfer much easier between institutions, but also individual slices of data can be accessed much more effectively. So that means that the climate scientists can now kind of do their work in a much faster pace than they previously could have done. And those sort of systems are the ones that can really help us deal with the climate crisis. I think that maybe the most promise of AI is we figure out some ways of doing things that we'll use to more efficiently with a smaller CO2 footprint. And these is really the most exciting kinds of technologies, because they mean that we can get closer to achieving net zero without having to drastically reduce our kind of living standards, because that itself might then kind of prompt a negative reaction from the general public, preventing us from doing so. Another thing that's really important here is, of course, that these systems that are trained at huge expense for multiple weeks or months burn through a huge amount of energy. And so there's also an argument to be made that while AI might help us deal with the climate crisis, the training of the biggest AI models actually contributes to them. And so it's a question really for the scientists and engineers to figure out ways in which we can train these systems more efficiently, such that we can harness the benefit without these huge CO2 emissions.
You know, you look at a piece of AI art and then you look at a piece of human art, and obviously like the level and skill of the AI art is good, but I'm such a big believer in anything made with hands like really translates. And I wonder, would AI ever like be seamless enough to appear as a human?
Yeah, I think it's fair to say now that some of the AI generated art could actually pass as human art. So say for imagery, I think we've seen tremendous amount of progress with a certain type of AI algorithm called a diffusion model, that has really kind of allowed us to create high resolution, incredibly sort of artistic forms of imagery. How should creatives react to this? Well, I think that some of the most interesting work I've seen has really been, instead of trying to fight this kind of innovation, has been trying to work with it. So I've seen plays in the theater where people work together with an AI chatbot to develop a play. We've seen composers trying to use AI to create a new piece of music. Perhaps graphic designers or architects can think of ways to do this. But I also want to kind of highlight to the fact that this doesn't happen without tension. So some of you might have heard about the Hollywood strike that happened earlier this year in the United States. And there you had a huge amount of actors, and those are not just sort of the famous movie stars, but many of them actually have a huge amount of training and years put into their craft and aren't very well paid at all. And they obviously feel this danger of maybe some of the nefarious uses. So there have been cases where people had their face used in a video game without permission, or people are kind of creating audiobooks, having their voice replicated, and other forms of this kind of bad use of AI. Right? So as we're going forward, not just in the creative domain, but overall, we have to figure out some of these tensions that will inevitably happen when there's some sort of replacement or displacement of jobs.